David, who had holed up in a little French farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. It was lent to us by a friend of a friend. This was a very remote and very primitive existence. And we stayed there for 10 months. We were about a mile away from the nearest hamlet, which had one tiny shop. And we had to rely pretty much on a grocery van that came around on Wednesdays every week, and on the bread vans that came around every morning if we got up in time. It's a bit difficult sometimes. And we just had this sort of surreal good life in the middle of the French countryside. We couldn't have a car, obviously, because that would be too easy to trace. And we had no heating. Quite often we didn't have any gas to cook on, so we had to cook on what was an open fire. It was bizarre. No TV, no radio, no nothing. All we had was a computer. That was the early days of the internet, and that was our link to the outside world. And during this time, David and John Wadham tried to negotiate with the government and say, well, look, we've got all this other evidence of criminality and incompetence, which he wants to give to the government to investigate, to have an inquiry with. And he wanted to be able to go back to the UK without being prosecuted, so long as he could give his evidence to the government, so long as there would be some sort of inquiry. To this day, the government has refused to take his evidence, to this day. Anyway, in frustration, after about 10 months of this, he decided to use the terms of the injunction that had been taken out against him, which meant that he could give a story to a journalist, and the newspaper could submit it to the government for clearance for publication. And he thought, well, look, they're not going to take the evidence about the Gaddafi plot. I'm going to give it to the newspaper again, and they can deal with it via the injunction. So we went up, this was late July 1998, we went up to Paris to meet our journalists, and they got the story written. They submitted it on a Friday afternoon late, when most bureaucrats and spies have disappeared off into the pub late Friday afternoon. And yet within 2 hours of that story being submitted, an urgent extradition request had been sent from the British government to the French, requiring that they arrest and extradite David Shayler. It took them about 24 hours to catch up with us, and thank God we were in Paris. We weren't stuck in our little farmhouse. I don't know what would have happened then. We were there on Saturday, the end of July 1998, and David, at that point, treated himself. He was a nutty football fan and hadn't managed to see his team play for 10 months. So he decided to go off to watch his team, Middlesbrough, play a pre-season friendly on Sky TV in an English bar. And he was on his way back, and I was waiting in the hotel bedroom for his return, and he was late, so I was a bit worried. And he rang me up on his mobile and said, I'll be there in about 10 minutes, don't worry, and then we can go out for some food this evening. So 10 minutes later, there's a knock on the door, and I think, oh God, he's forgotten his hotel key again. So I opened the door, and it wasn't David. It was 3 DST officers, which is the French equivalent of MI5. And they said they had Monsieur Shayler, they'd got him as he came into the hotel lobby, and all they wanted was his ID papers, his passport. And I was like, okay, knock on the door, the one you've been dreading for, well, it was nearly 2 years by that point. Just thinking, okay, here we go. I asked them, has he been arrested? They said no, he was just being taken away for questioning. And I knew we didn't have the passports in the hotel room. He knew we didn't have the passports in the hotel room, but he thought very quickly on his feet and sent the police up, so at least I knew he'd been taken. Because if he hadn't done that, I wouldn't have known where he'd gone. I would have had no knowledge whatsoever about what had happened to him. He would have disappeared. As it was, he disappeared into the prison system and was denied a lawyer for 3 days. He was put under a very strict provision called mise au secret, which is basically for traitors, because the British had told the French that he was a traitor selling secrets to an enemy power. So they really treated him toughly. I didn't see him again for 2 months, nor did his family. And eventually his lawyer got in to see him, thank God. When the British finally were forced to hand over the extradition paperwork, the case paperwork, at the end of the 2 months, the French took one look at it and realised what was going on. They said, this is whistleblowing, and relaxed the provisions under which he was kept. So at least I was allowed to go and visit him at last. But he spent almost another 2 months in prison, awaiting his hearing. But when we got to the hearing, of course the French said, well, look, this is whistleblowing, this is not treachery. And under French law, whistleblowing is a political act, and we do not extradite for political acts. So that was that. Merci à France is all I can say. It was lovely. But that day was quite intense for both of us. I mean, there's Dave in the dock, of course, but the decision is basically a choice between him being released that day or him being extradited immediately and held on remand for up to 2 years in prison, high-security prison in England. So it was quite a knife edge. And the media were all over us like a rash. It was like a rugby scrum, just trying to get into the courtroom. But that was quite a relief. After that, we decided not to go back to that farmhouse. I mean, you know, they knew where we were by that point. So we moved up to Paris, where we spent another 2 years. And he was literally stuck in the French borders. He couldn't leave the country because then they would have tried to extradite him from another country. I have to say, if you ever go on the run, if you're ever in exile, please go to Paris, because it is the most beautiful city for being in exile. And the people are so friendly. We had 2 years there where we took it as far as we could, pushing and pushing for an inquiry, getting some of the other stories of criminality out there in the public domain, really getting a debate going, for the first time ever, really, in public about the role of the spies and about what their accountability should be. And in those 2 years, we saw some other interesting cases. Another intelligence officer who had known us when we were in MI5 came out and asked support in the national papers. So a guy called Justin Thurkel-White went public in The Guardian in early 2000, which was great. He said, look, I know what these guys are talking about. It's all true. They managed to bury that story by leaking the memoirs of the former head of MI5, which were due to be published that day. So that became the big headline spy story, and Justin was a bit buried. Media manipulation is always good for the spies. And also, crucially, a document was leaked from MI6, which stood up the Gaddafi plot. Now, when Dave had given the story to the newspaper, which then submitted it under the injunction, the government said, oh, no, this is no basis in fact, it's pure fantasy. So, of course, that's the headline. David Shayler's in prison, he can't rebut it efficiently. In early 2000, this document appeared, and it basically said, yes, there was this plot, MI6 were aware of it, there was this agent, blah, blah, blah. This stood up what David had been saying. So, of course, there was this huge media clamour for an inquiry. And yet, the government just ignored it. They said, we have nothing to add or subtract to our previous statement, i.e. it's all still pure fantasy. And they've managed to wriggle off the hook ever since. It's quite amazing. Innocent people died. It was an illegal operation, and yet there has not been an inquiry into this. Anyway, after 2 years of really pushing it in Paris, we decided to go home. David said he would go back, face the music, stand trial. He hoped for his day in court so that he could actually put some of this evidence in front of the court and put it on the public record. We returned in August 2000, and he was only ever charged with the low-level stuff that appeared to begin with, files on politicians, illegal phone taps, that sort of thing. He was never charged with the Gaddafi plot, never charged with any of the IRA mistakes, and never charged with the Israeli embassy disclosures, just the low-level stuff right at the start. So he expected to be put on trial relatively quickly. The police had had over 3 years to collect the evidence by this point, so he thought he'd be in the Old Bailey, which is our big criminal court, within about 6 months. It took over 2 years for him to get in front of a jury, and the reason it took so long is because the government hauled him through a whole series of pre-trial hearings, legal hearings, to try and ensure that by the time he stood up in front of a jury, he was so hemmed around with legal rulings that he couldn't say anything. So in November 2002, he was on trial, and he was never allowed at any time to breathe a word about why he'd done what he did. He wasn't allowed to mention the Gaddafi plot, he wasn't allowed to mention any of the other cases. All the prosecution had to prove was that he had worked for MI5 and he had made a disclosure without the prior written permission of the head of MI5. That's all they had to prove. He also wasn't allowed to freely cross-examine his accusers and the prosecution witnesses. They wheeled out some of these senior MI5 officers, anonymously, of course, the journalists and the public weren't allowed to see their faces. And some of them were known to be liars, proven adulterers, and he wanted to just establish their reliability, just ask them some questions. He wasn't allowed even to do that. He had to submit his questions to the judge and to the prosecuting lawyer for vetting before he could ask them in court. And of course, they crossed them all out. Fair trial, anyone? And also, the final nail in the coffin was the fact the judge actually ordered the jury to convict. Now, in the UK, there is a provision called the right to make a perverse verdict, which is something that's been in existence under UK law for 300 years, where basically the jury can say, well, okay, so-and-so is actually technically guilty under the facts of the law, but in the interest of justice, we are going to acquit them. And that's how case law develops, it's precedent. In this case, that was taken away. The judge said, no, you have to find him guilty. No fuss from the media about that either. So, of course, the jury did find him guilty. He was actually at that time facing 6 years in prison under 3 counts of breach of the Official Secrets Act. I was sitting in the well of the court opposite the jury, and I could see that some of them were crying when the verdict came. But they just went along with it, I suppose. I think they knew that there was some sort of miscarriage of justice going on. I was allowed to give a mitigation plea, after the verdict. It was the only time either of us was ever allowed